November 8, 1944. Admiralty Research Laboratory, Teddington, England. A gray morning rain patters against the laboratory windows as Dr. James Whitmore, senior metallurgist, tightens the jaws of a tensile testing machine. Between the clamps rests a small steel bar 2 inches long, half an inch wide, cut from the pressure hull of U-534, a German Type 7 U-boat recently raised from shallow Danish waters. 3 weeks earlier, British divers had found the submarine lying quietly on the seabed, 40 feet down, its hatches open and charges blown. The crew had scuttled it to avoid capture. Now pieces of that same hull lie on Whitmore's bench, about to reveal a mystery that had haunted Allied naval intelligence for years. Reports had long claimed that Germany's Type 7 U-boats, the backbone of its undersea fleet, could dive safely to 200 meters. Captured documents from occupied France supported it. The hull steel, identified as S-52, was rated strong enough to withstand the immense crushing force of water at that depth. In theory, it was flawless engineering. Whitmore begins the test. The machine hums to life, pulling both ends of the specimen in opposite directions, measuring stress and strain with exact precision. The numbers climb steadily on the gauge. 300, 400, 500 megapascals. Then suddenly a sharp metallic snap echoes through the room. The bar has fractured cleanly. Whitmore checks the readout. The steel failed at a stress equivalent to water pressure at 140 meters, far below the expected limit. No warning, no stretching, no gradual yielding, just instant brittle failure. That should be impossible. German metallurgy was renowned for its excellence, strong, uniform, precisely alloyed. The sample should have endured to at least 200 meters, maybe more. Whitmore resets the machine, tests another piece. The result is identical. A third sample, same failure point. The data is undeniable. This isn't coincidence. Something is catastrophically wrong with the U-boat's hull steel. For months, naval intelligence had been struggling to explain a disturbing pattern. German submarines vanishing without trace. No survivors. No wreckage. Just silence. Out of 783 U-boats lost during the war, nearly 200 had disappeared in circumstances that defied all logic. Boats last reported in deep Atlantic waters, far from Allied patrol zones, areas with no recorded air attacks or minefields, boats that simply radioed their position, and were never heard from again. The official German explanation was always the same: enemy action. But the evidence never lined up. Allied naval records tracked every depth charge attack, every sinking, every confirmed kill. The gaps between confirmed actions and missing U-boats were far too wide to ignore. Whitmore stares at the fractured pieces of metal on his table. Could it be possible that these submarines weren't destroyed by Allied weapons at all, but by their own hulls? The Type 7 was the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet, sturdy, compact, and lethal. Over 700 units were built between 1936 and 1945. Each was a pressure vessel of welded steel, the central cylinder 21 millimeters thick, designed to endure enormous external forces. The steel, S-52, was rated at 520 megapascals tensile strength, good enough to resist collapse well beyond 250 meters. Engineers built in a safety margin. Test depth 200 meters. Crush depth 280 meters, the point of no return. Every U-boat commander knew those numbers. At 200 meters, the boat creaked and groaned but was still safe. Beyond that lay certain death, implosion within seconds, no chance of escape. But Whitmore's results changed everything. This steel didn't survive beyond the equivalent of 140 meters. That meant the theoretical crush depth wasn't 80, it was barely 180. The safety margin had vanished. Each time a submarine commander ordered an emergency dive below 180 meters to evade Allied depth charges, he was unknowingly betting his life on defective steel. Every deep dive could be the last. Whitmore's instincts as a metallurgist take over. He needs to know why the metal is failing. He cuts small sections from the sample, polishes and etches them with acid, then studies the microstructure under magnification. What he sees alarms him. Good steel shows fine, uniform grains, tight crystalline patterns that allow it to flex under stress. But the U-boat steel looks rough, irregular, almost chaotic. Large inclusions of slag, patches of unrefined impurities. The grains are coarse and uneven, the hallmark of steel made in haste, without proper refining or quality control. Something in Germany's production had gone terribly wrong. Next, he performs a chemical analysis. Ordinary S52 steel is a careful balance of elements: iron, carbon, manganese, silicon, and trace amounts of molybdenum. Each plays a role. Carbon gives hardness, manganese adds strength, molybdenum adds toughness and resistance to brittle fracture. The ratios must be exact. The results appear on his spectrometer. The carbon content is slightly too high, enough to make the metal hard but brittle. Manganese is lower than normal. Silicon is within range, but one number leaps off the chart. Molybdenum, 0.05%. It should be 0.25%, 5 times less than specification. Whitmore freezes. He knows immediately what this means. Molybdenum is rare, one of the few alloying elements that prevents steel from shattering under stress. Before the war, Germany imported it freely from Norway, Canada, and the United States. But after 1939, those sources were gone. The Reich's domestic mines could supply only a fraction of wartime demand. By 1943, shortages were crippling. The element was desperately needed for tank armor, aircraft engines, and gun barrels. Somewhere in the German chain of command, a decision had been made: reduce molybdenum in submarine hull steel to conserve supplies for other weapons. That decision was now killing their own sailors. Without molybdenum, the steel lost its ability to bend. Under pressure, instead of deforming, it simply snapped, brittle as glass. Whitmore reruns the tensile test once more, watching as the machine pulls the next specimen apart. The break is sudden, violent, clean. There it is again, brittle fracture. He notes the data, quietly aware of what it implies. Every U-boat diving past 180 meters could implode without warning. A week later, November 15, 1944, Whitmore compiles his findings into a formal report for the Admiralty. His tone is clinical, precise, but the meaning is devastating. Analysis of hull steel from U-534 indicates deficiencies in both composition and tensile properties. Strength approximately 30% below specification. Molybdenum content 80% below required levels. Estimated actual crush depth 180 meters. Type 7 U-boats operating near or beyond 200 meters are at risk of catastrophic failure. The report crosses the desk of Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief, Western Approaches, the man leading Britain's anti-submarine war. Horton had fought the U-boats for 4 years. He understands instantly what this means. If German submarines can't safely dive beyond 180 meters, the entire calculus of underwater warfare changes overnight. He orders an emergency conference for November 20th. Naval architects, intelligence officers, metallurgists, all gathered in a quiet briefing room in Liverpool. Whitmore stands before them, slides and charts laid out. He explains the tensile tests, the micrographs, the missing molybdenum. When he finishes, silence hangs in the air. Then come the questions. Are you certain of these findings? Yes, multiple samples, identical results. Could it be isolated to one U-boat? Unlikely. Shortages would have affected the entire production chain. How many boats are compromised? Possibly hundreds. The room falls silent again as realization sinks in. The Germans' deadliest weapon, the submarine that terrorized the Atlantic, was built with steel that could not survive its own operating depth. December 1944. Across the gray winter seas of the North Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic was entering its final, furious chapter. Allied convoys now steamed under heavy escort, destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft circling overhead, while the once feared German wolf packs were being driven into retreat. But beneath the waves, something else was happening. Something the Allies did not yet fully grasp. The German U-boat fleet was collapsing from within. In the underground U-boat bunkers of Kiel, Wilhelmshaven and Lorient engineers had begun to notice strange and troubling signs. During pressure chamber trials, new submarines creaked far earlier than expected. Rivets snapped. Welds bled thin lines of rust. Hull plates emitted faint metallic pings, tiny fractures forming under stress. At first, officers blamed sloppy assembly or unskilled labor. Wartime production had stretched Germany's industry to the limit. But as the failures multiplied, engineers realized the problem ran deeper. It wasn't workmanship. It was the metal itself. Inside the Kriegsmarine's Materials Bureau in Berlin, metallurgists examined their own data with growing unease. They knew about the shortage of molybdenum, They knew that the Reich's mines could no longer meet demand. By late 1944, German industry was cannibalizing scrap, melting down old armor, and diluting essential alloys just to keep production running. The official directive, signed months earlier by the Reich Ministry of Armaments, had quietly reduced molybdenum content in non-critical components. But the definition of non-critical had blurred. Desperate factories had applied the reduction to submarine hull steel as well. The result was catastrophic. By November, internal memos were circulating through the Kriegsmarine's shipyards warning of occasional brittleness in S-52 hull steel. The language was careful, almost evasive, but those who read between the lines understood its real meaning. The U-boat's once trusted armor was now unreliable. One German naval inspector described it bluntly in his log. Under repeated pressure cycles, the material fails suddenly, without yielding. The crack grows like glass. January 1945. At Flensburg, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, convened an urgent meeting of his engineering and U-boat command staff. His fleet was dying faster than it could be replaced. Allied hunter-killer groups roamed the seas with radar and aircraft, forcing his boats ever deeper in desperate dives. Now, reports were reaching him that even those deep dives could no longer be trusted. The engineers explained the situation. The alloy problem, the missing molybdenum, the brittle steel. Dönitz listened in silence, his face expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back. Then finally he spoke. "If what you say is true, then our boats are not safe beyond 160 meters. No one replied. "Issue the order," Dönitz said quietly. "Effective immediately, maximum diving depth for all Type 2 boats, 150 meters. No exceptions. It was an unthinkable command. For years, the U-boat had survived by slipping into the dark depths, below the reach of Allied sonar and explosives. Now that refuge was gone, the new U-boat Command Directive number 62145 was transmitted to every operational flotilla within 48 hours. It read simply, "Due to material conditions, maximum safe diving depth is to be reduced to 150 meters. Commanders are to avoid exceeding this limit except under direct threat." It was bureaucratic language for a death sentence. Veteran commanders were stunned. Many refused to believe it. They had trusted their boats, trusted the reassuring groans of the pressure hull, the sense that the steel could take anything the ocean threw at it. Now, that faith was gone. One commander, Kapitänleutnant Ernst Heinemann of U-1013, recorded in his patrol diary, "The new order will kill us. If we cannot dive deep, we cannot live. The sea is no longer our friend." Heinemann's words proved prophetic. On January 20th, 1945, U-1013 departed Bergen on what would be its final patrol. 2 weeks later, while attempting to evade a British escort group near the Shetland Islands, the submarine dived below 160 meters. A depth charge detonated nearby, only moderately close, but close enough. Witnesses aboard HMS Vanquisher later reported hearing a deep, muffled crump beneath the waves, followed by a long hiss of escaping air. Moments later, an oil slick surfaced. No debris, no survivors. The Royal Navy credited the kill to their attack, but in truth, the submarine may have died of its own weakness. The same pattern repeated again and again that winter. U-boats that should have withstood moderate pressure were vanishing without trace. In some cases, no depth charge explosions were even recorded nearby. They were simply gone. Meanwhile, in Britain, Dr. Whitmore's report had begun circulating quietly among senior officers at the Admiralty. By late December, the intelligence was shared with Allied anti-submarine commands. The implications were enormous. If German U-boats could no longer dive beyond 150 meters, the Allies could adjust their attack profiles accordingly. Previously, depth charge settings were spread across a wide range, 100 to 300 meters, to cover uncertainty. Now the Royal Navy began tightening those settings to 120, 160 meters, concentrating explosive power exactly where the U-boats now hid. Almost overnight, kill rates doubled. The Allies didn't need to know how many boats were affected, only that something had changed. The Germans' once terrifying undersea fleet was suddenly far more vulnerable, and Whitmore's discovery, though never made public, had quietly altered the course of the Atlantic War. By February 1945, the U-boat force was in freefall. Fuel shortages confined many boats to port. Allied bombers shattered shipyards and supply lines. And now, the ocean itself had turned against them. German engineers scrambled to find alternatives. They experimented with new steels, added nickel and chromium where they could, even attempted to reintroduce molybdenum in small batches from captured stockpiles. But it was too late. Each new boat rolled off the slipway weaker than the one before. The newly built Type 21 electro boats, revolutionary in design, were hamstrung by the same material crisis. Their sleek welded hulls were stronger on paper, but without proper alloying, they too suffered from cracking and fatigue. The future of submarine warfare had arrived, only to collapse under its own flawed steel. In March 1945, Admiral Donitz received the grim monthly loss report. 32 submarines destroyed, only 2 confirmed kills of Allied ships. He read the figures in silence, then folded the paper and placed it on his desk. The war at sea was effectively lost. He knew that even if his captains had the courage to fight on, their boats no longer had the strength to survive. The pressure hulls that once symbolized German engineering perfection had become coffins of brittle metal. Back in Teddington, Dr. Whitmore finished his final report for the Admiralty. It was marked confidential, to be sealed until further notice. He wrote a single line beneath his concluding paragraph. The most decisive factor in the defeat of the German U-boat was not sonar, radar, or aircraft, but the silent failure of its own steel. He closed the file and placed it in an envelope, unaware that his discovery would remain hidden for decades, buried in naval archives. Above him, the winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting pale light across the laboratory floor. On his workbench, the fractured pieces of U-boat steel still lay side by side, cold. Gray and lifeless, the war was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet surrender of a metal that could no longer bear its own weight. March 1945, North Atlantic. The wind howls across black seas streaked with white foam. Convoy HX-345 plows westward from Liverpool under heavy escort, its columns of Liberty ships crawling across the icy swell at 9 knots. Above, the night sky flashes with the probing beams of radar-equipped patrol planes. Beneath, somewhere in the depths, the remnants of Germany's U-boat arm lurk, fewer in number now and weaker than ever before. For nearly 6 years, these waters had been a graveyard for ships and men. The wolfpacks once ruled this ocean, sending Allied tonnage to the bottom faster than it could be built. But by the spring of 1945, the hunters had become the hunted. Every element of Allied warfare, radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, had converged into a relentless, coordinated killing machine. The U-boat, Germany's most feared weapon, was dying faster than its crews could be trained. Yet there was still one factor hidden beneath it all: the quiet betrayal of the U-boat's own steel. Aboard U-1009, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Mertens scans his depth gauge nervously as his submarine dives beneath the waves, pursued by a British destroyer. The hull creaks like a living thing. He glances at the indicator, 130 meters, 40, 50. He can feel it, the subtle vibration of metal under stress, the dull groans that sound different now, sharper, more brittle. His chief engineer whispers, "Sir, we should hold here." But the sonar pings above are closing in. The destroyer is tracking them. Mertens hesitates. For years, U-boat commanders survived by going deep, 200 meters or more beyond the reach of Allied charges. That instinct bred into every submariner urges him to dive, but the new orders forbid it. He stares at the depth gauge again. 160 meters, the hull shudders. Then comes a faint metallic crack, like the sound of ice breaking on a winter lake. "Level out," he shouts. The ballast tanks hiss. The submarine steadies at 150 meters. The destroyer above releases a spread of depth charges. 4 explosions roll through the water. The lights flicker. Pipes rattle. A seam opens in the aft section, spraying a mist of seawater into the control room. Mertens grips the periscope base, listening as the hull groans in protest. The boat holds barely. But the steel that once gave him confidence now feels like paper stretched too thin. He doesn't know it. But U-1009's hull steel came from a wartime batch smelted at Ruhrstahl AG, early 1944, one of the factories forced to reduce molybdenum content to conserve rare metals. That single decision made in a Berlin office months earlier now dictates whether his crew lives or dies. Back on the surface, British destroyer HMS Calder circles the area. Its sonar operator reports the contact fading. Commander Hugh Balfour, veteran of the Atlantic campaign, lowers his binoculars and shakes his head. "They've gone shallow," he mutters. "They're not diving like they used to." He doesn't know why, but he's noticed the pattern. Over the past month, every engagement ends the same way. The U-boats don't dive deep anymore. They linger within reach. Balfour radios the escort carrier tracker. "Recommend reducing pattern depth to 150. They're breaking off below that." The reply is immediate. "Confirmed. Adjust depth charge settings to 140 to 160. Maintain pressure." The Allies don't realize they're exploiting a weakness caused by German metallurgy. They only know their attacks are suddenly more lethal. By early April 1945, the statistics are staggering. Out of 49 U-boats deployed in March, 38 are lost. The highest single-month attrition rate in the entire war. Only a handful of boats return to port, most of them damaged or crippled. Crews report buckling hulls, burst rivets, and fractured ballast tanks. In Kiel, dockyard engineers note that nearly every surviving boat requires structural repair. The German press calls it enemy superiority. The engineers know better. They've seen the steel fail with their own eyes. In one case, at the Blohm and Voss shipyard, technicians examining the salvaged remains of U-320 discover that several hull plates had literally snapped across their width, clean fractures with no sign of deformation. The metallurgists confirm what they already feared: brittle failure under compressive stress. The ocean wasn't merely crushing these submarines, it was shattering them. Inside the collapsing Third Reich, the Kriegsmarine's engineering division sends a final, desperate memo to the Ministry of Armaments. It warns that continued production with diluted alloys will compromise the structural safety of all new vessels. But by now, the factories barely function. Allied bombers have reduced the Ruhr to smoking ruins. Rail lines are gone. Power is intermittent. In Berlin, the Armaments Ministry, under Albert Speer, acknowledges the report but can do nothing. The resources simply don't exist. Germany's once formidable industrial machine, the envy of the world, has ground to a halt. The same war effort that demanded total production has consumed the very elements needed to sustain it. On April 12th, 2511, one of the revolutionary new Type 21 Elektrobude, departs Kiel on her first and only war patrol. Her captain, Adalbert Schnee, is among the most skilled officers left. The Type 21 represents the pinnacle of submarine design: fast, silent, and capable of remaining submerged for days at a time. But even this masterpiece is not immune to the shortages that crippled the rest of the fleet. Engineers had done their best, substituting nickel and chromium where molybdenum was lacking, but the result was uncertain. During her sea trials, U-2511's crew reported worrying creaks during deep dives. Not catastrophic, but unnerving. The steel simply didn't have the resilience of pre-war alloy. Schnee would later describe in his memoirs how the hull sang under pressure, a sound unlike anything he'd heard before. Fortunately for him, the war ended before those flaws could claim his ship. By late April, the U-boat fleet was effectively finished. Of the 162 submarines built, over 780 had been lost, and the survivors lay idle in their pens, half-fueled, half-crewed, or trapped behind destroyed railways. On May 4, 1945, Admiral Dönitz, now Germany's head of state following Hitler's death, issued a radio order to all U-boats still at sea: cease fire, surface, and surrender to Allied forces. All across the Atlantic, periscopes broke the surface. Submarines that had once slipped unseen through the dark now rose one by one to meet their fate. For many Allied sailors, it was the first time they had seen their enemies' faces. The men who had stalked them through the night emerged pale, exhausted, and silent. As the captured U-boats were examined by Allied engineers, the truth soon became apparent. The steel was brittle, fractured, riddled with impurities. Some boats hauled into dry dock showed long, invisible cracks running along their pressure hulls, cracks that could have spelled death at the next dive. The war had not only defeated Germany's navy, it had destroyed the very metal it was built upon. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the Royal Navy's Intelligence Division compiled a secret post-war assessment, drawing upon Whitmore's earlier findings. The conclusion was stark. Material shortages in late-war U-boat production resulted in reduced structural integrity and collapse depths. Estimated average failure pressure, 180 meters. This factor, combined with Allied technological advances, hastened the destruction of the German submarine arm. In other words, Germany's defeat beneath the sea had been sealed not by depth charges alone, but by the silent weakness within its own armor. In the cold, empty lab at Teddington, Dr. James Whitmore read the classified report and nodded grimly. His discovery months earlier had now come full circle. The data he had gathered, the missing molybdenum, the brittle fractures, the failed tensile tests, had proven decisive. He placed his notes in a drawer marked Metallurgical Investigations, 1944-45, and locked it away. The war was over, but the lesson remained. Even the mightiest machine could fall to the smallest flaw. The Atlantic was quiet again. The wolf packs were gone. All that remained beneath the waves were their broken hulls, silent monuments to a war of steel, pressure and men, and though few would ever know it, the decisive blow that ended that war beneath the sea was not delivered by guns, bombs, or sonar, but by a missing trace of metal measured in fractions of a percent. May 1945. The guns of Europe fell silent. Across the shattered continent, the cost of total war became visible for the first time. In cities reduced to rubble, in the faces of refugees, and in the hollow silence that lingered over once mighty factories. In Germany's northern ports, Kiel, Hamburg, Flensburg, Wilhelmshaven, rows of captured U-boats floated motionless beneath the gray skies. Their conning towers bore the faded insignia of a vanished empire, their crews now prisoners. For the Allied officers inspecting them, these submarines were both trophies and mysteries, technological marvels that had nearly strangled Britain's lifeline, yet somehow collapsed in the final months of the war. To understand why, the Allies began the most comprehensive forensic investigation of naval engineering ever undertaken. In June 1945, British and American naval engineers convened in Hamburg under Operation Deadlight, the code name for the disposal of captured German submarines. Before the boats were scuttled, samples were taken from hulls, welds, and structural members. Each fragment of metal was logged, labeled, and shipped to laboratories in Teddington, Portsmouth, and Philadelphia. Among the analysts was Dr. James Whitmore, now working with the Allied Technical Intelligence Service. He had spent months studying steel from U-534, and now he would compare it with dozens of others, Type 7s, Type 9s, and the advanced Type 24 electrobute. The findings were consistent and damning. The post-war metallurgical surveys revealed three crucial truths. First, the chemical composition of late war. German hull steel varied wildly from batch to batch. Molybdenum, critical to ductility and fracture resistance, was present in some samples at only 1/5 of pre-war specifications. Second, wartime alloy substitutions, particularly the use of excess carbon and reduced manganese, had made the steel harder but dangerously brittle. At deep pressures, it fractured suddenly, leaving no time for the crew to respond. Third, welding quality had deteriorated sharply as skilled labor disappeared and production accelerated. Many hull seams were porous, containing microscopic cracks that expanded with every dive cycle. Together, these factors meant that by 1944-45, the average Type 7's true crush depth was not the designed 280 meters, but closer to 170-190. The U-boats had literally lost the ability to survive their own environment. As the tests continued, another revelation emerged. Comparing samples chronologically, Whitmore noticed a distinct timeline of decline. Pre-1941 steel, uniform, resilient, almost flawless. 1942-43, slight reduction in alloy content but still reliable. 1944-45, catastrophic drop in toughness, severe brittleness. It was a metallurgical fingerprint of a nation starving for resources. Germany's industrial collapse could be traced not just through bombed factories or shattered rail lines, but through the atomic structure of its steel. Every missing atom of molybdenum told a story, of mines exhausted, trade routes severed, and a war machine devouring itself to stay alive. While Whitmore's team documented the science, naval historians soon recognized its strategic consequence. Between 1940 and 1943, U-boats had sunk over 2,700 Allied ships, nearly winning the Battle of the Atlantic. But in the final 2 years, as Germany's alloy supplies dwindled, U-boat performance plummeted. Dive depths were reduced. Survivability declined. Maintenance times increased. Crews reported more mechanical failures, not just in hulls but in engines, valves, and turbines, all suffering from inferior metal. The Allies' growing mastery of radar, sonar, and air coverage had been decisive, but the Germans' own steel had finished the job. When the brittle hulls began imploding below 180 meters, the ocean itself became the Allies' most effective weapon. Autumn 1945, London. In a quiet conference room at the Admiralty, Whitmore presented his final report. Bound in plain brown covers, it bore a simple title: Metallurgical Deficiencies in Late-War German Submarine Hull Steel. He summarized the evidence before a panel of senior naval officers and scientists. Charts of stress curves, chemical analyses, and micrographs lined the table. "Gentlemen," Whitmore said, "the Germans did not lose the U-boat war purely to superior tactics. They lost it to chemistry." One admiral leaned forward. "You mean their steel failed?" Whitmore nodded. "It failed them exactly when they needed it most." There was silence in the room. Then another officer quietly observed, "It seems the Battle of the Atlantic was fought as much in the foundries as in the sea." The report was sealed and classified. Only a handful of people ever read it in full. Its conclusions were too revealing, not about the enemy, but about the terrifying fragility of modern industry under total war. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Hamburg, German engineers pored over their own post-war analyses. Some refused to believe that the flaw lay in the steel, blaming poor maintenance or Allied pressure. But the surviving metallurgists knew the truth. A 1946 report by the former Kriegsmarine, Materialprüfungsamt, Germany's Naval Materials Testing Office, quietly admitted that by 1944, the mechanical properties of pressure hull steel had declined below acceptable safety margins due to substitution of strategic elements. They had known, at least in part, what was happening. But the war had given them no choice. Production targets had outweighed safety. As one anonymous German engineer later confessed, "We knew the steel was not as it should be, but the war demanded boats, not perfection. We built them anyway." Operation Deadlight continued through the winter of 1945-46. One by one, over 110 captured U-boats were towed into the Atlantic and sunk by gunfire, torpedoes, or explosive charges. As they slipped beneath the waves, few realized that many of those boats were already on the edge of collapse. Some sank even before reaching the scuttling zones, their weakened hulls giving way in rough seas. Each one carried with it a story of engineering brilliance undone by desperation, of machines built to survive crushing depths, yet doomed by shortages measured in ounces of alloy. For decades, Whitmore's report remained buried in the Admiralty archives. Historians focused instead on the visible heroes of the Atlantic War, the destroyer captains, the codebreakers of Bletchley Park, the air crews of Coastal Command. It was not until the 1970s, when declassified documents and recovered U-boat wrecks were studied by ocean archaeologists, that Whitmore's findings resurfaced. Deep-sea dives to the wrecks of U-534 and U-1021 revealed identical fracture patterns, brittle failure, not explosive damage. Metallurgical analysis confirmed low molybdenum and high carbon content, exactly as Whitmore had recorded 3 decades earlier. The evidence was undeniable. The collapse of the U-boat arm was as much a story of material science as of naval combat. In the end, historians came to describe it as a paradox of war. Germany's technological ambition to create machines of unmatched precision had outstripped its own material means to sustain them. The U-boat, once a symbol of engineering superiority, became a victim of its own industrial exhaustion. Every dive, every creak of the hull, every sudden implosion in the depths, all were echoes of a simple, invisible truth. When the alloy fails, no courage or strategy can save the men inside. Dr. Whitmore retired quietly in 1952, his wartime work still classified. He never spoke publicly about his findings, but those who knew him said he often kept a small piece of fractured U-boat steel on his desk, a reminder of the war's quietest victory. It bore no markings, just a jagged break across its center, sharp and cold to the touch. When asked about it once, he replied softly, "That little crack ended 1,000 voyages." Epilogue. Today, the rusted wrecks of the U-boat still rest on the seabed, silent, corroded, and covered in silt. Divers who visit them often note how the steel flakes away at a touch like old slate. Few think about the chemistry that doomed them, or the scientists who discovered it. But the lesson remains, written in every fractured plate and collapsed hull. In war, the mightiest machines fall not only to enemy fire, but to the smallest flaws within themselves.